Hello everyone. So, this is a review I've been thinking about getting around to for some time. This is going to be less of a review and more of an informal discussion, or just a free-form discussion of what I think to be the merits of the Iliad and why I should read it. And really, the goal for this review is mostly going to be trying to dispel perhaps some intimidation that you might feel, and really why it's, but also why it's important to read the Iliad and why you should put in the effort to read the Iliad, I suppose, and don't be afraid of it. In case that sounds condescending, I felt like I wasn't prepared for the Iliad for a very long time, and I only read this in 2019. But I was pleasantly surprised, especially with the translation that I chose, the Lattimore translation from 1951. The book isn't actually as intimidating as it sounds. The thing about so I basically chose out of a very long list of translations, the Lattimore translation, because the language in this translation is very much simplified. There's a lot of repetition, but the language used is very simplified. So you might be aware that the history of the Iliad goes obviously a long way back. But in terms of the translations, there are so many of them, and there are so many, like, for example, there's the Pope translation. There's also the Fagles translation as well. They can be quite intimidating. They use a lot of archaic language. It's the whole, so for example, it'll be something like, "O illimitable Jove, I have conceived great troubles upon my enemy," or something like that. Just, you see what I mean? It's more, so for example, that was a terrible example that just came up with the top of my head. There'll be, so the Lattimore Iliad Homer will say something like, and he crossed the big river, whereas Pope will say something like, yonder flowing stream of great extent, or something like that. And of course, what I'm trying to get at is it can be a lot more intimidating in terms of the language. So if you want to read the Iliad from a more accessible point of view, I would definitely suggest going with the Lattimore. And of course, the point about the Iliad is meant to be, it was orated originally. There's a lot of repetition, and the whole thing about classical literature is, and spoken works of fiction, is that they use repetition to sort of, it's sort of like a device to memorize certain parts and sort of to go off. So if you memorize this bit and it comes around via repetition, it basically helps to get everything out in a good flow, sort of thing. So really, it can be quite intimidating, but I think if you go for the simplified and quite accurate, the Lattimore translation is accurate to the, I think anyway, the actual original Iliad, and that's what people said. I did a lot of research on this, and I decided to go for that. But anyway, the Iliad itself, it's one of the crowning achievements of Western literature. It really is. For me, it's also it feels like the beginnings of fantasy. Of course, you have things like obviously you've got Egyptian mythology, and you've got the Epic of Gilgamesh. For me, it feels like the Iliad is just the beginnings of the foundations of myth and magic. It's heroism and magical gear. It's just everything that you'd imagine from. To me, it feels like it's the Silmarillion in Greek. It's the Greek version of the Silmarillion to me. And this also brings up the point that if you're already familiar with books like the Silmarillion, if you're familiar with books like the Worm Ouroboros, I think you'll have no problem reading this book. Now, to get into the history, just a little bit of the history, and there's actually a great introduction. It's a very long introduction, very scholarly introduction to the Iliad in the Lattimore translation edition, which goes through all of the history. It goes through. It's brilliant. I highly recommend reading it first, even if you're familiar with the history and the mythology. Lattimore goes into a lot of depth, and one of the things he points out is that the Iliad itself is only just one part of an epic cycle. And I'm looking at a table here. The Iliad itself is composed of 24 books, and that's just the second earliest fragment or part of the cycle. The Kypria is the first. The Kypria is the events leading up to the Trojan War and the first 9 years of the conflict. Now, the Iliad itself is, I believe, only a year, or not even a year. And then it goes on to the Aethiopis, the Little Iliad, the Sack of Troy, the Nostoi, and then the Odyssey is the second last one, and the Telogony, which I believe would mean the ending, if I got my Greek correct. Yep, so it's the ending. So you can see it's just one small part of it. So you might wonder how that fits into obviously iconic images such as Achilles or Achilles being shot in the ankle by the arrow. So that doesn't actually happen in the Iliad, and a lot of the stuff doesn't happen in the Iliad that you might be familiar with from the film Troy with Brad Pitt and Orlando Bloom. So that's really just the basics of what the Iliad is. Now, let me just get this up here. The Iliad is mostly it's what I like to describe it as a protracted conflict where we get flashbacks and we get sort of tangential scenes and sequences that relate to the war going on the ground, but it gives a good we basically get the reasons for going to war. So for example, the thrust of the conflict is between the Achaeans and the Trojans, and the Achaeans are a sort of league. You can think of them as the Greeks. The Trojans are obviously, there's a whole thing about whether or not the Trojans are technically Greeks and whatnot, but that's a whole other separate thing. Now, I'm sure you're aware of this if you've seen the film and just know a bit of history. The Achaeans include people like Agamemnon, one of the sons of you get Agamemnon and Menelaus, the two sons of Atreus, or so they're called Atreides. We have Achilles, which I'll probably refer to as Achilles, is just how I know him from the Latin translation. We've got, of course, Odysseus, famous Odysseus from the Odyssey. We've got Nestor, who is a wise advisor. We have Ajax the Great, who you might be familiar with in the film, the 2004 film, The Great Shield. Diomedes is actually he plays a big role in the Iliad. He's a favourite character of mine. He's an impressive character, raging Diomedes. And we have Ajax the Lesser, who is it's a little bit confusing. I can't quite remember. There's two Ajaxes. This guy is the son of Ilias. I think Ajax the Great is Telamoni and Aias. It's kind of confusing, but Telamoni and Ajax is the guy with a great shield, and Ajax the Lesser is the son of Ilias. We have Lord Idomeneus, who is commander of the Cretans. Patroclus, or Patroclus, of course, you're probably familiar with him. He's Achilles' closest companion. And we've got Neoptolemus, who is actually the leader of the Myrmidons, which of course is Achilles' sort of warband. And I've got a whole bunch of Trojans on the Trojan side. Of course, I'm not going to go into all of these, but I've got Hector, of course, great Hector. I've got Aeneas. Now, Aeneas is obviously the founder of Rome, if you're familiar with that. He plays quite a big part as well. We have people like Paris. Now, obviously, Paris is I'll get into the how things start for the Iliad, but of course, Paris is named Alexandros in the Iliad. He is the Prince of Troy and the son of King Priam. He's also the Helen's lover as well, and of course I'll get into that in a bit later on. We've got Priam, one of my favourite characters. Actually, Priam is an influence for one of my major characters in a work of fiction that I wrote. It's actually one of my main sort of world building projects, started in 2016, sort of a great passion of mine. Priam is modelled on a character in my work of fiction there, so one of my favourites there. We've got people like Sarpedon and Glaucus, two great warriors. We've got Pandaros as well, a famous archer, quite liked him. And of course we have the Trojan women, so Hecuba, which is Priam's wife. So you can see there's a great cast of characters here. That's what I'm trying to get at. There's a lot of really great iconic characters here, and you eventually do come to know them. It does take quite a while though. We have, of course, Helen, daughter of Zeus. Andromache, the princess of Troy, Hector's wife. Cassandra, Priam's daughter. Cassandra played a big part in after the Iliad. And then Briseis, Trojan woman captured by Achilles from a previous siege. Now, that's just to go into the heroes of the Trojan War. We have, of course, the gods, and these gods are, interestingly, I wasn't quite aware of this before I'd read the Iliad, but they're actually allied. The gods of the pantheon, the Greek pantheon, are allied to the Trojans and the Greeks and the Achaeans in different ways. So, for example, we have Zeus. He's neutral. He sort of swings back and forth, which is quite fun to see and quite interesting. We have Hera, who is for the Achaeans. Artemis for the Trojans. Apollo, quite significantly, for the Trojans. Aphrodite as well for the Trojans as well. Just it's interesting to see the way that the main part of the Iliad is the sort of the little people on the ground, and in the great council of the gods, and how the good thing is that there's all the strife on the ground, but then we also see above the gods are just as sort of petty and liable to strife and trouble, and they constantly fight with each other, and then that of course has impacts for the warriors on the ground. And even the minor deities such as Scamander as well, which I believe is a river god, eventually it does have a part to play in with there's actually a scene that I quite enjoyed where I think it's the river Scamander tries to drown Achilles. Now that really helps me there with another thing that I was going to mention. The Iliad, you might get the impression that if you've not read it before, that it's can be quite dry. It's not at all dry. It's very magical. It's very fantastical as well. The the film Troy doesn't show how much the gods play a part in the Iliad. It's quite significant. There's not only do the gods actually help either side at different times for different reasons, we actually have the gods coming down and cloaking themselves as different heroes, and we have great environmental, not catastrophes, but it's almost like spells that they use, and for example, Zeus will stand upon Mount Ida and cause a great storm to happen. There's all sorts of other stuff. There'll be even I can't remember. I think it is Diomedes the Great, raging Diomedes actually attacks one of the gods. I'll have to check my notes as well. But it does feel like this epic mythological scale conflict, and it's not just the humans versus the humans. It really is an epic work of fiction or mythology. So yes, there's a lot to unpack here, and one of the things that of course I've just mentioned a couple of the characters and a couple of the gods as well, but one of the things you'll have to brace yourself for is the fact that there's hundreds upon hundreds of names. There's actually a meme, and there's a bit of a joke that there's a section in the Iliad called the Catalogue of Ships, and that is pretty much just a colossal list of all the different forces, and it basically just reads as a list of names and numbers. That reminds me, there's also a part, if you've read the Mabinogion, there's a part in there, I can't remember what story it is, but there's a huge part in the Mabinogion which is just a list of names. I think in the Mabinogion there's actually more names than the Catalogue of Ships in the Iliad, but basically there's a ton of names that you're going to have to get your head around, and it took me quite a while to remember all the different factions and who was allied to who and who's fighting who. But as this is quite a large work of fiction, you do get this, over time there's a development where you're not quite sure to begin with, but then things start to sort of cohere and become more concrete, and you'll know, oh yes, I'm rooting for Diomedes here, and oh, I want Aeneas and Alexandros or Paris to win, and it's quite enjoyable in that sense, where you're sort of rooting for different people. So really, though, that's really as much as I want to say in terms of how the Iliad is structured, how it feels to read it. The Iliad, I'm going to mention another channel here. You might be familiar with Lindy Beige. He done a really quite an emotional and powerful review, quite a short review of the Iliad and what the Iliad means. Although there is a huge mythological scale conflict, the Iliad is very much it's about the people, and it's about the families, and so although we'll hear about how Hephaestus crafts golden armor for Achilles, and it just how and the petty squabbles between Aphrodite and Athene, or Athene, Pallas Athene, it just all these different sort of large scale events. It always comes back to death and destruction, and the losses, the great losses of this war, and it really is quite personal. We get the thing about the Iliad is it focuses in on just these very small scale conflicts, and there's always really the Iliad is a series of battles. That's what it comes down to. It does get a little bit, just to go into the cons as well, whilst I'm at it. It does get quite repetitive in the sense that most of the Iliad is composed of fighting, and it will always be two people facing up to each other and trying to square off, and of course in this sort of archaic style we'll have these sort of declamations, if that's the correct word, or declarations of the deeds and titles and of each fighter, and then we'll have the conflict itself and the battle, and then there'll always be a death, and then there'll be the warriors will try to loot the body and bring it back and so forth. But so it all comes down to these small scale conflicts, and it really some of the passages are quite poignant as well, of course. So actually, one of the things I forgot to mention, of course, quite important, is how this conflict really starts. And I'm just going to read this little section here, just for ease of sort of it's fairly sort of summarised. So, according to classical sources, the war began after the abduction or elopement of Queen Helen of Sparta. Now, Sparta is allied to its Greek, Achaean side, by the Trojan prince Paris or Alexandros in the Iliad, the Latin or Iliad. Helen's jilted husband Menelaus of the Spartans convinced his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, to lead an expedition to retrieve her. Agamemnon was joined by the Greek heroes Achilles, Odysseus, Nestor and Ajax, and accompanied by a fleet of more than 1,000 ships from throughout the Hellenic world. They crossed the Aegean Sea to Asia Minor to lay siege to Troy and demand Helen's return by Priam, the Trojan king. So that's really how things begin. I'm sure you're aware of that. It's the face that launched 1,000 ships. It's that thing, really. In terms of how the actual Iliad begins, just as a little bit of background, and again I'll read a little passage here. This is just a good summary of how this starts, really. So one of the things I might have forgotten to mention is that, so of course the Iliad itself is just one small part of this great epic cycle. However, that leads to the flight of Aeneas and the beginning of Rome, essentially. That whole saga. The actual Iliad itself is not only is it the very beginning of this whole saga, this whole cycle. It's actually the Iliad itself begins at the end of the Trojan War. So we're only getting a very small part of it. Now, the actual Iliad itself begins after an invocation to the Muses. The story launches in medias res toward the end of the Trojan War between the Trojans and the besieging Achaeans or Achaeans. I sort of switch between Achaeans and Achaeans, if I'm being honest. Chryses, a Trojan priest of Apollo, offers the Achaeans wealth for the return of his daughter, Chryseis, there are two similar names there, held captive by Agamemnon, the Achaean leader. Although most of the Achaean army is in favour of the offer, Agamemnon refuses. Chryses prays for Apollo's help, and Apollo causes a plague to afflict the Achaean army. After 9 days of plague, Achilles, or Achilles, the leader of the Myrmidon contingent, calls an assembly to deal with the problem. Under pressure, Agamemnon agrees to return Chryseis to her father, but decides to take Achilles captive, Briseis, there's similar names here, as compensation. Achilles furiously declares that he and his men will no longer fight for Agamemnon and will go home. Odysseus takes a ship to return Chryseis to her father, whereupon Apollo ends a plague. So that's really how things begin. It's if you've seen the film, of course, you'll be aware that Achilles is a reluctant fighter. That's the whole point. He does not want to fight at all because he's been disrespected by Agamemnon. That's really how things begin. Now, I think I'd like to end on a couple of my favourite excerpts, and hopefully that'll give you an idea of just the epic feeling of the Iliad and the poignancy and just why you should read the Iliad. It's for me, I'm so glad that I read it. I was always intimidated by it, but and I'll say that I read it on Kindle. I perhaps should have read it on paperback. I think it would have felt more official. It might have felt more it just seemed weird to read such a substantial work just on a little tablet, really. But so here are some of the excerpts from the Iliad. The beginning. Sing, goddess, the anger of Peleus' son, Achilles, and its devastation, which put pain thousandfold upon the Achaeans, hurled in their multitudes to the house of Hades, strong souls of heroes, but gave their bodies to be the delicate feasting of dogs, of all birds, and the will of Zeus was accomplished since that time when first there stood in division of conflict Atreus' son, the lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. Another excerpt here from the beginning. But Peleus' son once again in words of derision spoke to Atreides, Agamemnon in this case, and did not yet let go of his anger. You wine-sack with a dog's eyes, with a deer's heart, never once have you taken courage in your heart to arm with your people for battle, or go into ambuscade with the best of the Achaeans. No, for in such things you see death. Far better to your mind is it, all along the widespread host of the Achaeans, to take away the gifts of any man who speaks up against you. King who feed on your people, since you rule non-entities. Otherwise, son of Atreus, this were your last outrage. But I will tell you this, and swear great oath upon it, in the name of this sceptre, which never again will bear leaf nor branch, now that it has left behind the cut stump in the mountains. Nor shall it ever blossom again, since the bronze blade stripped bark and leafage, and now at last the sons of the Achaeans carry it in their hands in state when they administer the justice of Zeus. And this shall be a great oath before you. Some day, longing for Achilles will come to the sons of the Achaeans, all of them. Then stricken at heart though you be, you will be able to do nothing, when in their numbers, before manslaughtering Hector they drop and die. And then you will eat out the heart within you in sorrow, that you did no honour to the best of the Achaeans. This part here is just a part that I always remember. It's really quite evocative of the sort of grand scale of the Iliad, and to make basically the context of this is that Poseidon himself and Zeus are actually making Aidoneus, the unseen one, or Hades, the lord of the dead below, leap from his throne essentially in the underworld. I found that very epic, and really it shows just how, again, fantastical the Iliad can actually be compared to the film, the famous film. From high above, the father of the gods and men made thunder terribly, while Poseidon from deep under them shuddered all the illimitable earth, the sheer heads of the mountains. And all the feet of Ida with her many waters were shaken, and all her crests, and the city of Troy, the ships of the Achaeans. Aidoneus, lord of the dead below, was in terror, and sprang from his throne, and screamed aloud, for fear that above him he who circled the land, Poseidon, might break the earth open, and the houses of the dead lie open to men and immortals, ghastly and mouldering, so the very gods shudder before them. Such was the crash that sounded as the gods came driving together in wrath. For now, over against the lord Poseidon, Phoebus Apollo took his stand with his feathered arrows, and against Enyalios, the goddess grey-eyed Athene. Against Hera stood the lady of clamour, of the golden distaff, of the showering arrows, Artemis, sister of the far striker. Really, it's just the way that it's written. It gives me goosebumps. It's such poignant and weighty language, and again, it's always if you've read my Song of Ilion review, and perhaps A Worm or Remorse as well, you'll be aware that I love that sort of weighty language. It's really great stuff. Now, I suppose you could call this a spoiler, but I'm sure you're aware of what happens. This is the fight between Hector and Achilles. It's actually near the end. In his weakness, Hector of the shining helm spoke to him. I entreat you, by your life, by your knees, by your parents, do not let the dogs feed on me by the ships of the Achaeans, but take yourself the bronze and gold that are there in abundance, those gifts that my father and the lady my mother will give you, and give my body to be taken home again, so that the Trojans and the wives of the Trojans may give me in death my right of burning. But looking darkly at him, swift-footed Achilles answered, No more entreating of me, you dog, by knees or parents. I wish only that my spirit in fury would drive me to hack your meat away, and eat it raw for the things that you have done to me. So there is no one who can hold the dogs off from your head, not if they bring here and set before me 10 times and 20 times the ransom, and promise more in addition, not if Priam, son of Dardanus, should offer to weigh out your bulk in gold, not even so shall the lady your mother, who herself bore you, before you lay on the deathbed and mourn you. No, but the dogs and the birds will have you for all their feasting. So this next scene here, I can't quite remember if it's the full armour that is given to Achilles. You may be aware that Achilles is given armour, crafted by Hephaestus. It's a really great scene. I can't remember if this part here is he's given all the armour and then he goes out after all his sort of moping and reluctance to fight the Trojans, or whether it's just the Aegis, but nonetheless, this is an incredible section where it feels very fantastical again. It's really great stuff. So speaking, Iris of the swift feet went away from him, but Achilles, the beloved of Zeus, rose up, and Athene swept about his powerful shoulders the fluttering Aegis, and she, the divine among goddesses, about his head circled a golden cloud, and kindled from it a flame far shining. As when a flare goes up into the high air from a city from an island far away, with enemies fighting about it, who all day long are in the hateful division of Ares, fighting from their own city, but as the sun goes down, signal fires blaze out, one after another, so that the glare goes pulsing high for men of the neighbouring islands to see it, in case he might come over in ships to beat off the enemy, so from the head of Achilles the blaze shot into the bright air. He went from the wall and stood by the ditch, nor mixed with the other Achaeans, since he followed the close command of his mother. There he stood and shouted, and from her place Pallas Athene gave cry, and drove an endless terror upon the Trojans. As loud as comes a voice that is screamed out by a trumpet by murderous attackers who beleaguer a city, so then high and clear went up the voice of Iacades. Yeah, just incredible stuff. I probably couldn't. I regret that I couldn't read that as well as I perhaps might have done. There's quite an interesting sentence constructions in the Iliad, especially this version where it's sort of run-on sentences, but really great stuff. So actually this review turned out to be quite a lot longer, and there's so much more I could say. There's so many great scenes. So that was the Iliad. There really is so much more I could say about this. So much more about sort of magical events and all the gods, and just the poignancy of just like Hector meeting his wife and child, and just Priam, of course, pleading to Achilles. There's just so much stuff here. Again, it's the crowning work of Western literature for me, really. It's astonishing stuff. So I obviously highly recommend that you read the Iliad, and I wish I could do the review justice, but just it's brilliant stuff. So I'll see you all until next time. Thanks for watching.